Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Middelton Hall. It's our absolute pleasure to welcome you back to another Inspired in Hull event. We are absolutely delighted with our guest speaker this evening. Thank you so much, Tracy, for coming up. Thank you all for being here. Can I just ask that you turn your phones off, please, so they don't interfere with our streaming, and obviously don't interrupt the Vice-Chancellor or Tracy. So thank you very much. Have a lovely evening, and I will introduce our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Petley.
Well, good evening from me as well. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the latest in our distinguished series of Inspired in Hull lectures. And we're really delighted to be joined this evening by Tracy Borman. Tracy graduated from the University of Hull in 1997 with a PhD, having completed her thesis on the career of Sir Francis Vere, a military commander best known for his successful campaigns in the Low Countries during the 80 Years' War. Tracy also made time during her doctoral studies to take on a graduate teaching assistant role in the department, a crucial first step as an educator in a stellar career that has seen her take on her passion for history and apply it to a wide range of areas, including children's education, heritage conservation and access, and engaging the public with the nation's history. After university, Tracy took on roles with the Heritage Lottery Fund, the National Archives, and English Heritage, before later becoming the chief executive of the Heritage Education Trust, a charity that encourages children to visit and learn from historic properties. A prolific author, she's published 13 books in the last 15 years, including both fiction and non-fiction works, and she also contributes regular articles to BBC History magazine. Several of her books have been adapted for other media, including TV and radio. This includes her seminal work, The Private Lives of the Tudors, published in 2016, which sought to bring a new understanding of the Tudor monarchs, including Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, through a focus on the private realm and, in particular, the role played by the ever-present consorts. Tracy offered up a vivid portrait of a world in which the minutiae of life had to be constantly witnessed. Bodily functions, ablutions, and fertility were all in scope. As Elizabeth I once complained, 1,000 eyes see all I do. A popular television adaptation followed in 2016 in the form of a 3-part documentary presented by Tracy, alongside other contributors. A cast of actors provided often touching glimpses of life in the privy chambers of Tudor England. A focus on detail and relatability also characterised Tracy's book, Elizabeth's Women, which featured as Book of the Week on Radio 4. Rather than to seek to understand Elizabeth I through the wide lens of European wars or fratricidal plots, Tracy turned to the ladies-in-waiting, the gentlewomen of the chamber and her sisters and cousins, all of whom enjoyed a level of access that was similarly unrestricted by modern etiquette. The account explicitly avoids recasting Elizabeth as a member of a sisterhood, a notion rather undermined by evidence of her treatment of the women around her. It nevertheless highlighted the extent to which the lives of royal women, even those as strident in political decision-making as Elizabeth, were rather dominated by fear and speculation about their biological credentials. Tracy's career also led her to acquire a unique and important role in shaping how we perceive the history of our monarchy. In 2013, she was appointed as Joint Chief Curator for Royal Historic Palaces, an estate that encompasses Hampton Court Palace, the Tower of London, Kensington Palace, Kew Palace, the Banqueting House, Whitehall, and Hillsborough Castle. Working with architectural historian Lucy Worsley and a team of curators, Tracy is responsible for the way that the palaces are presented to visitors today. In recognition of her significant achievements, Tracy was awarded an honorary degree from the University of Hull in 2017. Other accolades have followed, including in 2020 an honorary fellowship in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen Mary University of London. She also holds fellowships of the Society of Antiquarians and the Royal Historical Society, and in 2021 she was made an honorary professor at Bishop Grotest University in Lincoln. This honour was compounded in 2022 when she was appointed Chancellor. This is just a snapshot of Tracy's career, and I'm in no doubt that there are many chapters still to be written. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage our Inspired in Hull speaker tonight, Dr. Tracy Borman.
Well, thank you so much, Vice-Chancellor, for that lovely introduction. And I can't tell you what an absolute delight it is for me to be back in Hull, a place that has so many very special memories for me. I spent 7 incredibly happy years here, becoming an eternal student, really, doing one degree after the other. And before I talk to you about my new book, I want to just share a few of my memories and also how Hull has inspired my career, because it really has. I wouldn't be doing what I do now if it wasn't for the time that I spent in Hull. Well, I am actually a Lincoln girl. Lincoln is my home city. I think that makes me a yellow belly. For those in the know. And Lincoln is where my love of history began. Certainly, it's a very historic city, so I was surrounded by it. And one of my earliest jobs was here in Lincoln Castle. And what you see on the right there is the prison chapel, because Lincoln Castle has a prison, or it did, in the Victorian period. And this was a period when the Victorians believed that prisoners should be kept separate from each other. So even in the chapel, you can see segregated pews so that they couldn't look at each other, talk to each other. And my job was to dress up as a Victorian jailer and show tourists around the prison chapel. And it gave me a real taste for that sort of thing. But I knew I loved history, and I thought, well, I should probably study history. But I can't say that I set out from the very beginning with a really clear idea of what I wanted to do beyond that, beyond just surrounding myself with history. Well, when it came to applying for universities, I went on various open days, and nothing really hit home until I came here. And that just changed everything for me. At the moment I stepped into Hull University, I felt like I was coming home. It had an atmosphere that was so unique, so welcoming, and I think that is something that hasn't changed a bit, and a lot else has changed here, I can tell you, since we'll gloss over how many years it has been since this photograph was taken. On the right, I've raided my old family albums here, and this is me on my very, very first day at Hull University, arriving at Thwaite Hall, which was then a hall of residence, in Cottingham, and you might see the Everton poster that I put up on the wall before anything else. I don't know why Everton, by the way, but anyway. And that's really where it all began. And I owe so much to Hull in so many ways, and quite apart from the professional debt I owe Hull, there's a huge personal debt as well, because this is where my best friendships were made. I'm on the right, by the way, there in that. Everything was oversized in the 90s, in an oversized T-shirt, in Scarborough, eating fish and chips with my friends. And the friendships I made during my 7 years in Hull have proved to be lifelong. My best friend there, she will kill me for showing this, but my best friend Alice, and we still meet up regularly, and including recently on a rooftop tour of Hampton Court, and it all started here at Hull. But of course, professionally, its impact on me was profound. It completely ignited my growing love of history and made it something that was that I knew I had to spend my life doing. And it was, oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I have completely messed with the technology. I'm hoping somebody can come and rescue me from this, because I've managed to go into, anyway, you can still see the picture. But I knew that I just wanted to be surrounded by history for the rest of my life. And I was lucky enough to have amazing facilities here at Hull, including the library, which now is almost unrecognisable. I was giving a tour of it earlier, and the incredible exhibition space there in the library. And it's here. I don't know if I even dare press another button, but there you go. I'm hoping maybe some technical assistance will emerge at some stage so that you just get... It's on its way. Thank you very... Oh, there you go. Maybe that'll work. Thank you so much. I promise not to press any other buttons that I shouldn't. So the library was where I spent many happy hours, but it was also in Hull and actually working in the archives, which were then in the library, that gave me a love of original documents and a love of archives. And one of the things that I studied here in Hull has stood me in good stead throughout my career, and that's paleography, the study of old handwriting. It's like historical code breaking. And I did a lot of that down in London whilst a student in Hull. I went to the National Archives. Here, this is really aging me now, because the National Archives used to be on Chancery Lane in London, and I spent a lot of happy hours there sifting through documents such as this one, written by my all-time historical heroine, Elizabeth I. And so my love of archives was definitely born at Hull. But it was while studying for my PhD here that I also undertook volunteer work in heritage as a way of sort of getting a foot on the ladder when I finally graduated and stopped studying. And one of the best bits of experience I had was here at Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire, a Tudor mansion built for a visit by Henry VIII, although he failed to show up, but never mind. It left the owners with a rather wonderful extension to their castle. And so by the time I did finally graduate, curls and all, in 1997, I had both qualifications in history, of course, but also experience in the world of heritage. Well, I may have graduated in 97, but that wasn't the end of the story for me and for Hull. I'm very pleased to say, as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned, I was incredibly honoured to have been given that honorary degree back in 2017. And here's me receiving my PhD. And I have since gone on to represent the university in a number of other ways as well, such as my infamous, I think we'll call it, appearance on University Challenge back in 2019, when I am proud to say I got the sum total of one question correct. And that question, the answer to the question that I got correct was the Muppets Christmas Carol. Didn't get any of the history ones, but I knew the Muppets Christmas Carol when I heard the theme tune. So there we go. And since leaving Hull, although, as I say, I haven't left it behind. So my career has been very much in heritage. This is where I started out in heritage, really, before going into writing. And my early jobs, as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned, included the National Archives, which was just like being a kid in a sweet shop, surrounded by all these amazing treasures, such as Shakespeare's will and telegrams from the Titanic. It's an amazing collection. And all the way up to my present job at historic royal palaces, where I spend a lot of time in the Tower of London, usually filming a series about the Tower of London, actually, which gets me to some very, very interesting places. And I've done an increasing amount of television work, and I have to say this was purely accidental. I didn't set out to present TV programmes. The history came first, and I think that's quite important to stress, in that I guess it's possible just to set out to be a history presenter, but you sort of need the goods to back it up. So television companies tend to find experts. So you need to have established yourself a bit in the world of history before you get to hang out with Danny Dyer at Wolf Hall, his ancestral home, as it proved, because he's related to the Seymours and to pretty much every member of the royal family. Well, the other thing that has arisen from my time in Hull is that I regularly lecture now. I give quite a few lectures across the UK every year, and also abroad. I've done some lecture tours of the States. Now, this is one thing, or one of the many things I'm grateful to the university for, because believe me, the training I got in giving talks to undergraduates when a graduate teaching assistant here at the university is something that I will never forget. You will not get a tougher crowd than a group of undergraduates who would rather be in the student union bar than in one of your lectures or seminars. And so I learned a great deal from that. My first seminar that I took, which should have filled an hour, I managed, after pulling out every trick in my very small book, to make last 15 minutes. And then I just gave up and I let the students go, because clearly they didn't want to be there. I've learnt from that. I've learnt from that now. And it was all thanks, really, to that early experience. But I think what I spend most of my time doing is writing books, mostly on the Tudor period, and that's certainly the subject of my studies here at Hull. But I've branched out, and particularly with my latest book, because that covers a whole history of the monarchy. And it's that I want to turn to now, because it's all about the history this evening. And I feel I would shortchange you if I didn't give you a decent amount of history. And this book, the idea for it, I had a few years back when I knew that the Queen's Platinum Jubilee was approaching. And so I thought that would be a really historic moment, actually, to take a look back at some of the predecessors of the Queen, to set her reign into some kind of context, and prepare us for the Jubilee. This is actually the Diamond Jubilee back in 2012, but prepare us for marking the Queen's 70th year on the throne, because that was going to be the only royal event that we were talking about in 2022. And then, of course, it has since been far overtaken by other events, and the death of the Queen, the incredible scenes that we saw with the queuing for the lying in state, for the funeral, and it now feels even more of a historic moment than when I first set out to write this book. Well, it has been history in the making, and the Queen did break so many records. It was such an extraordinary reign. I don't think we'll see the like of it anytime soon, if at all. But comparing the Queen to some of her 41 or so predecessors was a fascinating exercise for me. And at the heart of my book are the personalities of those kings and queens themselves. Not just the institution of monarchy, but the actual people who occupied the throne of England, then Britain, from 1066 all the way up to 2022. Now, I've shown this slide numerous times since the book came out at the end of last year. And to most people, it doesn't mean that much, and I have to explain where it is. I suspect I don't need to explain to most of you because it is in Beverley. It's St Mary's Church, a beautiful ceiling there in Beverley, depicting every king, I believe, from Anglo-Saxon times up to Henry VI. It really is one of our greatest treasures, a real hidden gem. As well as the personalities, I do look at the institution of monarchy in my book, and I really want to give you a flavour of just how ancient the monarchy is. Because if you compare it to the English law courts, shown top right there, they're 850 years old. Parliament is 750 years old. But the Crown, as a political institution, is 1,150 years old. Well, studying that, of course, it soon became obvious how much has changed during those centuries. But what really struck me when writing this book was how much has stayed the same. So when you look at Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953, it bears a very startling resemblance to that of her ancestor, Egbert, the 9th century king of Wessex, even down to some of the music that was played. There is a startling amount of continuity when it comes to the royal family. So many of the royal events we watch today on television have been played out time and time again over the centuries. I should just say a word before getting to the nitty-gritty, sharing some of the stories of the royal family, is that I keep saying British monarchy or English monarchy, but actually there have only been a handful of years when the incumbent of the throne has been English, because we've had the French Normans, the Welsh Tudors, the Scottish Stuarts, and then the German Hanoverians all the way up to the present day. Well, it is a whistle-stop tour I'm giving you this evening. Don't worry, I'm not talking about all 42 monarchs, the Queen included. In fact, perhaps 43 with our current king, as I'm still getting used to saying. What I've done is to cherry-pick moments that I think were the most significant in the development of the crown, and frankly, just to share some of my favourite personalities and stories from almost 1,000 years. Well, for the early part of its history, it was very much a case of monarchy by conquest, because the early medieval monarchs didn't just have to be good rulers, they had to be good warriors as well, because the crown tended to be won and lost on the battlefield. And this was the case with the first monarch in my history, and he really epitomizes this warrior king kind of mold that I'm talking about. And he was, of course, William the Conqueror, victor of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. I hope it's still the date that every schoolchild knows. I'm not sure. But William was one of the most brutal, the most feared warriors in Europe when he took the crown of England. He became Duke of Normandy at the age of just 8, and he was illegitimate. But his father had no legitimate children, so he left the Duchy of Normandy to William. And William spent his childhood and his youth on the run from murderous relatives who believed that they had a better stake to the Duchy of Normandy than he did. And this sort of chiseled him in to this ruthless man. And to give you an illustration of just how ruthless he was, William, as Duke of Normandy, was once besieging the town of Alençon in France. And the town was proving quite stubborn. It was withholding his siege. And so as a punishment, when he and his men finally battered down the walls of the town, William ordered that the citizens be rounded up and the hands and feet of every one of them be struck off, men, women, and children. That's how brutal William the Conqueror was. When he became King of England in 1066, that was only the beginning. It was one battle. It was a key battle, but he had years of bitter campaigning ahead of him before he finally brought England to heel. And a key tactic for William was to build castles. He built them everywhere as symbols of Norman domination. I would argue, of course I'm biased, that the greatest example is the Tower of London. This central keep was built by William in the 1070s. I think it still looks in remarkably good order today, but there were many other examples of Norman castles across the kingdom. Other great warrior kings I could mention include Edward III, victor of the Battle of Crecy in 1346, and Henry V, hero of Agincourt in 1415. And it's thanks to these kings that future kings of England could also style themselves kings of France, because they conquered so much territory across the Channel. I love the fact, by the way, kings of England continue calling themselves kings of France for centuries after, and long after they'd lost anything more than a postage stamp-sized piece of land across the Channel. But these were the real deal, Edward III and Henry V. There's a running theme, though, in the history of the monarchy, that often you get a dazzlingly successful king or queen, like Henry V, and they tend to be followed by the exact opposite. Now, in Henry VI's defense, he didn't have much going for him when he became king because he was just a baby. Henry V died after contracting dysentery whilst on campaign. He died before his time. And that's the other running theme I should mention in the monarchy. When the crown is left to a child, that doesn't tend to work out very well. And that was certainly the case now with Henry VI, who lost control of his kingdom, plunging it into civil war. It's become known as the Wars of the Roses between the rival houses of York, hooray, the White Rose, and Lancaster, the Red Rose. Well, the crown changed hands something like 6 times in 30 years during this, the most violent period in the entire history of the monarchy. And I could share all sorts of stories with you from this time, but speaker's prerogative, I've chosen my favourite. And the reason it's my favourite is because it's still one of the most intriguing, one of the most dark chapters in the whole history of the crown. It's that, of course, of the princes in the Tower. Well, I've learned after giving this talk a few times and my previous talks about the Tudors and this period to check first whether there are any members in the audience of the Richard III Society, because I will slightly edit what I'm going to say. If there are, I can't see any hands going up, but let's just, let's tread carefully. We are in Yorkshire, after all. But, so the story is, and I'm sure you're aware, but let me just briefly recap. The princes in the Tower were the sons of Edward IV. He was a very charismatic king from the House of York. But like Henry V, he died before his time. He contracted a fever, and he died in April 1483. On his deathbed, knowing that his eldest son, Edward, shown there on the right, was still only 12 years old, he bequeathed the power of the kingdom to his brother, shown on the left, Richard of Gloucester, until his eldest son, Edward, came of age. Well, Richard became Lord Protector, and the first thing he did was to place his nephews, so his eldest nephew, Edward, and his younger brother, Richard, then aged 9, into the Tower. Now, that immediately sounds rather ominous, doesn't it? Richard places his nephews into the Tower. But actually, in Richard's defense, it made complete sense, because the Tower might be renowned now as a place of execution and torture and imprisonment, but it was a royal palace, and it was a very secure royal palace, and Richard needed to keep his nephews safe. Well, they were safe enough. For a few weeks, they were seen playing in the Tower, shooting arrows, walking the walls. But as that summer after their father's death progressed, they were gradually seen less and less. And by the end of the summer of 1483, those 2 boys were never seen again. What had happened to them? Well, it was widely assumed at the time, and has been by many ever since, that they had been quietly murdered on the orders of their uncle. Now, there is reason for that supposition. That's all I'm saying. That's all I've ever said against Richard III, because by the time of his nephew's disappearance, he'd had them declared illegitimate and himself proclaimed King Richard III. He'd seized power for himself. But were those boys even murdered? Let alone who did it, if they were. There have been many conspiracy theories, even one in recent times, which claimed that the elder of those princes actually escaped and made it to Devon, and apparently he's depicted in some stained glass in a church there. I'm personally not all that convinced by that. I think the likelihood is those boys were murdered in 1483. And a key part of my reason for that is that in 1674, so almost 200 years later, an important discovery was made at the Tower of London. The then King Charles II had ordered demolition works because it had fallen out of favour as a place to stay for the royals. So he was pulling down the old royal palace when the workmen discovered underneath a staircase in a locked casket 2 skeletons. And they were skeletons of children whose ages matched those of the princes at the time of their disappearance. More than that, they found velvet close to the bones. Now, velvet wasn't a material that just anybody could wear. It tended to be reserved for royalty. Those remains became something of a tourist attraction. People flocked to the tower to see the missing princes. And Charles II certainly believed that's who they were, because he ordered that they be reburied in Westminster Abbey, a place of royal burial. Well, there they remained until the 1930s, when they were exhumed and subjected to analysis, such as it was then. And there have been calls in recent times, particularly since the discovery of Richard III's skeleton, for them to be exhumed again, so that modern science can take a look and decide once and for all, through DNA testing and the like, whether those bones really are those of the missing princes. But there's a problem, because you can't just dig up any old bones in Westminster Abbey. Ultimately, it needs the permission of the sovereign. And the late Queen would never grant that permission. She said whoever those boys were, or those children were, she thought they should rest in peace. But I have it on good authority that King Charles will give his permission. So who knows, maybe the mystery is going to be solved at last. Well, it would be rude in any talk on the monarchy not to mention this man, wouldn't it? Henry VIII, he's gone down in history as our most famous king. Why? Well, because he set up the Church of England, making himself and all subsequent monarchs supreme heads. He revolutionized government, forged a sense of national identity. But that's not why Henry VIII is famous. Let's face it, it has something to do with the women in his life, and specifically the 6 wives. You see the first of them here, Catherine of Aragon, shown on the left. Now, I'm often asked, which of the wives was Henry's favourite? If you believe Henry's PR, it was Jane Seymour, wife number 3. I think that's nonsense, personally. She's just the one who gave him a son. I think actually Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was probably his favourite. They were happily married for almost 20 years, but things started to go wrong when, despite numerous pregnancies, she only had 1 surviving child, the Princess Mary. This wasn't an age where queens were seen as a good thing. Henry needed a son to secure the Tudor succession. So that just heightened the appeal of a certain lady who first made her appearance at the English court exactly 500 years ago this year, Anne Boleyn. She's the most famous, I think, of the 6. A fact that Henry would absolutely hate, because he did his best to erase her from history. Anne Boleyn, though, was his great obsession. And that obsession is testified by the love letters that still survive, 17 of them, from Henry to Anne. Frustratingly, we don't have her replies. They have not survived. But Henry's letters have. Intriguingly, they're now in the Vatican archives in Rome. Well, that love of archives that I mentioned led me to Rome, and I was lucky enough to be granted permission to go and look at those original letters from Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn. A real shivers down the spine moment. And that photograph you see in the centre is one that I illegally took on my phone because photography was not permitted in the Vatican archives, but you can see why I was tempted. They are beautiful, 15th century frescoes on the walls. And those letters really show Henry's passion, his obsession with Anne Boleyn. He comes across like a lovesick teenager. On one of the letters, he's drawn a love heart around the initials AB. And so he was determined to have Anne at any cost, but she famously wouldn't be his mistress. She would only be his wife. So he started to think the unthinkable, setting aside his faithful wife, Catherine, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. It wasn't going to be easy. In order to get permission, he needed the Pope. The Pope famously refused. That's when Henry decided to just cut us off from the rest of Roman Catholic Europe, set up his own church, make himself supreme head of that church. And in the wake of that came devastation, came dissolution. And that was particularly felt here in Yorkshire, the destruction of those monasteries that had been such a powerful force in the society of medieval England all the way through to Tudor England. Now they were torn down brick by brick. But Henry thought it was all going to be worth it, all of this turmoil, because by the time he finally married Anne in January 1533, she was already pregnant. So she'd given way right at the end when she was sure the crown was going to be hers. And she was very visibly pregnant when she was crowned in June 1533. And then on the 7th of September that year, everything went according to plan because Anne gave birth to the child who would go on to become the glory of the Tudor dynasty. But Henry didn't know that because in his eyes, she had failed. She had given him just another daughter. What possible good could come of Elizabeth? I think it's one of history's greatest ironies. If only Henry had known, he could stop trying for a son. But of course, he didn't know, and neither did poor Anne, who suffered really from increasing, intense pressure to give birth to a son after failing at her first attempt. And poor Anne suffered a series of miscarriages, we think probably 3 miscarriages, the last of those in January 1536, when it was claimed she was far enough advanced in her pregnancy for the midwives to tell that it was a boy she had carried. That seems to have been the last straw for Henry. He privately instructed Thomas Cromwell to get him out of the marriage. Well, Cromwell was an enemy of Anne Boleyn by then, so he had his own reasons for getting rid of Anne, and perhaps more permanently than Henry had envisaged. He concocted a case of adultery against her, with not just 1, but 5 men, including incest with her brother George. There was no chance for Anne. Even before she stood trial at the Tower of London on the 15th of May 1536, Henry VIII had already sent for the executioner from Calais. And he sent for a swordsman. This was seen as a great kindness by the king because the sword was the swifter, more reliable death than the axe. Well, here you see a later representation of that moment on the 19th of May when Anne was beheaded. As you can see, they got that detail wrong. They show the executioner wielding an axe. It was a sword with which Anne was beheaded. From that moment on, Henry made sure it was as if she had never existed. The very next day, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. He ordered that all of Anne's emblems, her initials, be taken down from the palaces. Her name shouldn't even be mentioned. But he didn't quite succeed, I'm happy to say. And this is what keeps me coming back for more with Tudor history in particular, because we think we've got everything. And then something like this shows up. You may recognize it because it had its moment of fame in the press. This beautiful carved oak gilded falcon. It came up at auction a few years ago. And it didn't look much when it was sold. It was black, maybe by soot, maybe because it had been painted black deliberately. We don't know. But it was spotted by the right person. He's called Paul Fitzsimmons. He's a specialist in Tudor antiques. And even though it didn't look that stunning, there's something about it that Paul thought might be quite special. So he paid the asking price, £75, and he had it restored. And underneath the black, he soon found this gilding and the red and white Tudor roses, and the fact that the falcon, which wasn't clear when he bought it, is crowned. It's carrying a sceptre. And the falcon just happens to be Anne Boleyn's most famous emblem. So his hunch was right. This was very, very special. And he told me about it when I was working at Hampton Court one day, and I will still remember the moment when that email popped up, and I really couldn't believe what I was hearing and seeing in these beautiful photographs. Paul gave us the falcon for some analysis in our conservation lab, and we dated it very precisely from the paintwork and from the woodwork to 1533. Interesting year, the year Anne Boleyn became queen. We then did some research in the building accounts at Hampton Court, and we found an order from Henry VIII to his appropriately named carpenter, Michael Joyner, for 150 carved oak falcons, gilded, it said. And the dimensions, the description matches that of the newly discovered falcon. Exactly. So Paul Fitzsimmons had discovered the only surviving falcon that had been taken down. All the rest were destroyed. We assume this one was saved. We don't know by whom. We don't know where it's been all this time, but we have it back, and it's now on display once more in the Great Hall at Hampton Court. Do you want to know how much it's worth now, by the way? £250,000. So that was £75 very well spent. Well, Anne's greatest legacy, of course, wasn't the falcon. It was her daughter, Elizabeth. She became queen in 1558. And even though she'd been less than 3 years old when her mother had been executed, Anne Boleyn had a profound impact on her daughter for the rest of her life. She shaped her into the queen that she became. But even though we now see Elizabeth as Gloriana, one of the greatest sovereigns we've ever had, there was widespread unease when she came to the throne, because, as I mentioned, this was not an age when queens were favoured. And to be fair to the Tudors, although there was a lot of sexism at play here, there weren't too many shining examples of queens regnant before Elizabeth. She'd been directly preceded by her sister Mary, shown on the right there, Bloody Mary, as she's gone down in history because of her burning of Protestant heretics. Her reign was very brief. Even briefer was that of Mary's predecessor, Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, who was seen as a usurper, probably quite rightly. She didn't hold on to power. So Elizabeth had all of that prejudice to overcome, and she did it in style. By the end of her reign, she'd completely confounded expectations. She saw off rival claimants left, right, and centre. This was her most dangerous rival, Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, as she's better known. She had a very strong claim to the English throne, and she was also Catholic, which made her very dangerous, because at least half of Elizabeth's subjects were also Catholic and wanted to get rid of this Protestant heretic who sat on the throne. Well, Mary lost control in Scotland. She fled to England in 1568, hoping that Elizabeth would send her back to Scotland with an English army. Elizabeth was far too clever for that. She kept Mary prisoner here in England for almost 19 years, until 1586, when Mary was implicated in a plot against Elizabeth, led by Anthony Babington, a Catholic gentleman. And Mary had established a secret correspondence with the plotters, which Elizabeth's great spy master Walsingham was intercepting every step of the way. So he soon had proof of Mary's guilt and presented it to his queen, who was very reluctant to have Mary executed for a number of reasons, not least that it set a dangerous precedent to execute an anointed queen. But she eventually realised she had no choice. Mary was executed at Fotheringay in 1587. Well, Elizabeth faced an immediate backlash from Catholic Europe. Philip of Spain launched the Armada the following year to avenge Mary's death, or so he said. He just wanted to get his hands on England, I think. But it turned out to be Elizabeth's finest hour, and she vanquished the Armada with the help of her brilliant navy and probably even more help from the good old English weather, which blew those Spanish ships off course. One of the reasons Elizabeth, I think, was our greatest monarch is that she made the most of these PR opportunities. So she had 3 separate versions of this painting commissioned to celebrate the victory. She had medals struck. She gave that famous speech about being but a weak and feeble woman, but having the heart and stomach of a king of England too. And she really went down in history from this moment as the stuff of legends. Gloriana, as I say, good Queen Bess. But she's also known to history, even more famously, as the Virgin Queen. I personally think it was the right decision of Elizabeth not to marry. It would have been deeply divisive. But when it came to the succession, there was a small snag with remaining the Virgin Queen because, of course, she had no children to pass her throne to. So when she died in March 1603, the throne passed to her closest blood relative, James VI of Scotland, son of her old rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, who now became king of a united England and Scotland. Well, the Stuarts had a very different style of monarchy to the Tudors. They didn't really buy into the need for all the pomp and the pageantry. What they did believe in, though, was the divine right of kings, and they thought that this gave them the right to ride roughshod over the wishes of their people and of their parliaments. And this was taken to extremes by James I's son and heir, Charles I, who, if Parliament didn't agree with him, simply dissolved it. And he kept doing it. But he did it once too often until Parliament rose up against him, plunging the country into civil war, which culminated ultimately with the end of the monarchy. The king himself was put on trial for high treason and executed in January 1649. That was, as I say, the end of the monarchy. It was almost the end of my book, and I have to say there were times I wished it had been. It was quite a book to write, but no, the Commonwealth, such as it was, only lasted for 11 years, and then Parliament invited Charles's son to come back from exile and to take the throne as Charles II, to restore the monarchy. Only 11 years. I think perhaps Parliament and its great leader, Oliver Cromwell, had focused so much on getting rid of the king, they hadn't thought enough about what to replace him with. And therefore, Oliver Cromwell became king in all but name, really. And when he died, he was succeeded by his son, Richard, who fell far short of what was required as the leader of the Commonwealth, hence the monarchy being restored. But having won power, Parliament was not foolish enough just to give it all back to the crown. So Charles II restored the monarchy on very specific conditions. Now it was made clear Parliament had the political power, not the monarch. And this was set in law in 1689 with the Bill of Rights. It's not the most famous date in our history, 1689. I would say it's the most important date in the entire history of the British monarchy, because it's from then, with the Bill of Rights, which was agreed to by the joint monarchs, William and Mary, that the monarchy became a constitutional monarchy. In other words, the monarch no longer rules, they merely reign. It's a sort of ceremonial position. All of the power rests with Parliament. Well, the other monarchs in Europe laughed at William and Mary. How humiliating to give away your power in this way, they said. But look what happened to those other monarchies who didn't make that concession to their parliaments, to their people. They started to fall like a house of cards, particularly in France, in very bloody fashion. So I think the Bill of Rights actually was what saved the British monarchy, why we still have a monarchy today. And during the 18th century, the 1700s, this was the era of the endless succession of Georges. It was the Georgian era. And the monarchy starts to take on new roles to replace the political power that it had lost. It's patron of the arts and sciences. It's philanthropic. It starts to evolve its charitable role. And I think that role is still at the heart of the monarchy today, and still a big argument for keeping the monarchy, in my view. But the monarchy during the 18th century also undertook another rather more interesting role, that of being the moral head of the nation. So really the king was seen as the ideal, head of the family. His morality set the tone for the rest of the country, which was all well and good for the first three Georges, but it fell apart a bit with the fourth George, Prince Regent, during the so-called madness of his father, King George III. He called that regency playing at king. He didn't really take it very seriously. He was heavily in debt, millions and millions of pounds, because of his profligate lifestyle. He himself admitted to liking wine and women rather too much. Well, he came up against some of the most distinguished politicians of the age who were always trying to curb his spending. One of them was the Duke of Wellington, hero of Waterloo turned politician and ultimately Prime Minister. Wellington hated George IV, but he had a lot to do with him. And on one occasion, he visited George at Buckingham Palace. And George was about to start his meal, so he saw no reason to stop, just because Wellington was there. And so he made Wellington wait until he'd finished his meal. And Wellington was so flabbergasted by what he saw the king consume that he wrote it down. And I'm going to share his meal with you this evening. The king was served, so Wellington said, a pigeon and beefsteak pie, of which he ate 2 pigeons and 3 beefsteaks, 3 parts of a bottle of Moselle, a glass of champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy. What I didn't mention is that was his breakfast. So you can see how things went the way they did. It wouldn't be until 1837 that finally there was another morally upstanding monarch on the throne once more, and it was, of course, Queen Victoria. She was the daughter of George III's 4th son. So the irony is George III had 15 children, many sons. None of them saw the point in marrying. And they had between them 52 illegitimate children. No illegitimate children. Until suddenly they realized this fact, and there was sort of a baby race between the sons of George III, who quickly started marrying. Edward, Duke of Kent, the 4th son, married a German princess called Victoria, and they were quickest off the mark with that legitimate child, Victoria, or Alexandrina, actually, her first name, born in May 1819 at Kensington Palace. Here you see her as a child, clutching a miniature of her father, who described her as being plump as a partridge and a pocket Hercules, because she had a very strong will. Sadly, he died just a few months later, which is why she's clutching his miniature and why her mother is dressed in black. Well, Victoria had only just turned 18 when she became queen in June 1837. And we see her here dressed in white. That's a bit of poetic license, actually, because she was actually in mourning in black for the death of her uncle, but the artist wanted to show her as young and innocent amidst all of these distinguished politicians who gathered for her first Privy Council meeting at Kensington Palace. You might just make out there the man standing at the table with the blue sash is the Duke of Wellington. Well, he was much more impressed with Victoria than he had been with her wicked uncle, as he was known, George IV. He said, the way she conducted herself with ease and self-possession was as if she'd been performing the part for years. Victoria was hugely popular. She was the life and soul of the party, not that dour old widow who was never amused that we tend to think of her as. She married very early in her reign to her cousin, Prince Albert. It was a true love match. They were very close in age, little known fact. They had the same midwife to deliver them. And they went on to have 9 children, 42 grandchildren, and 87 great-grandchildren during Victoria's lifetime. Imagine remembering all the names, let alone the birthdays. And it's for good reason that Victoria became known as the grandmother of Europe, because she made sure that her children and their children married into the royal families who still survived across the continent. It all came crashing down, though, for poor Victoria when, in 1861, her beloved Albert died at the age of just 42. All was over, she recorded in her journal that evening. She was so grief-stricken that she retired from her public royal duties for more than a decade. She couldn't bear to be seen by her people. But life didn't stand still while Victoria was in retirement. This was the age of industry and empire, when Britain boasted an empire on which the sun never set. And it's synonymous with Victoria, but she can't really claim much credit for it. So that's why I always contest her being one of our greatest monarchs. I think she might be up there, but she's not the greatest. Well, she was eventually persuaded back because during her retirement, there was a growing Republican movement. People were questioning the value of the monarchy because they never saw their monarch. And this reached a low point when somebody pinned a note to the gates of Buckingham Palace that read, "Available to let due to declining business." And that made the front page of the Times. Well, Victoria came back in the 1870s, and her Prime Minister at the time was very glad about that fact, but he soon had cause to regret it because she came back with rather more opinions than she'd had before and rather more determination to express those opinions. This is when the pocket Hercules came to the fore. And there's a lovely note by her long-suffering private secretary, Sir Henry Ponsonby, who really gets to the heart of Victoria's stubbornness. He said, "When she insists that 2 and 2 make 5, I say, I cannot help thinking they make 4, ma'am. She replies, there may be some truth in what I say, but she knows they make 5. Thereupon, said Ponsonby, I drop the discussion." Victoria reached her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, and you can see vast crowds turned out to celebrate that event. And on the eve of her death in 1901, a contemporary historian remarked, "It appeared as if some monstrous reversal of the course of nature was about to take place. The vast majority of her subjects had never known a time when the Queen had not been reigning over them." How those words have resonated over the past couple of months. Well, I've mentioned a few themes in the history of the monarchy, and actually the one that relates most to our late Queen is often the most successful monarchs were never supposed to come to the throne at all. If things had gone according to plan, the very debonair Prince of Wales, you see there on the left, he became Edward VIII. He would have stayed king. He would have married somebody he was allowed to marry, perhaps had children to pass the throne to. But when Edward became king in 1936, he was already deeply in love with an American divorcee called Wallis Simpson. Now, as head of the Church of England at a time when the church forbade marriage to divorcees, he couldn't marry Wallis and stay king. So he had to choose. And eventually, of course, he chose Wallis. He gave up his throne for love. How romantic, I used to think, until I researched Edward VIII for this book. And now I think, what a lucky escape we had. He was completely ill-suited to be king. He was lazy, he was vain, he had a shockingly cruel streak. Edward had a younger brother called John, who had never been a very well child, and he died at just 13 years old. And on his death, Edward wrote to their mother, Queen Mary, and effectively told her to get over it because she was showing too much grief after a week. And he said that John's death had been nothing more than a regrettable nuisance. So as I say, I think we had a lucky escape when he abdicated in favour of his younger brother, shown on that magazine cover, Bertie. He became King George VI. And he's shown there with his wife Elizabeth and their 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret. We 4, he affectionately called his family. They'd led a blissfully private existence until now. He didn't want to be king, probably the most reluctant king in our history. He said he awoke on the morning of his coronation with a sinking feeling, but he knew his duty, and that sense of duty was something he passed to his eldest daughter and heir, Elizabeth. A few days after their uncle's abdication, the 6-year-old Princess Margaret, shown on the right, saw a letter on the mantelpiece of their Piccadilly home addressed to Her Majesty the Queen. She turned to her sister Elizabeth and said, "That's Mummy now, isn't it? Does that mean that you will have to be the next queen?" And when her sister said it did, Margaret replied simply, "Poor you." And apparently from that day forward, Princess Elizabeth began ardently praying for a brother. But that brother never materialized, and here we see Princess Elizabeth on her 21st birthday in April 1947, when she made that much quoted in recent times speech to the Commonwealth. "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service." Well, other monarchs have made similar declarations, but few with greater sincerity, and none for as long as Elizabeth II. She became queen upon the death of her father in 1952, by which time she was a married mother of 2. She'd married Philip Mountbatten back in 1947, and even though she was Britain's 8th Queen Regnant, there were still issues relating to her gender, most notably what the new royal house should be called, because it was the House of Windsor. But this is the 1950s. Women tend to take their husband's name on marriage. So people thought it might be the House of Mountbatten or the House of Edinburgh after Philip's title. But no, Elizabeth chose to keep Windsor as the name. And this prompted one of the earliest of what would be a number of outbursts by her husband, Philip, who said, "I'm just a bloody amoeba. I'm the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his children." But there was one thing that Philip definitely got his way with, and that's that the coronation of his wife should be televised for the first time in royal history. You can imagine the feathers that were ruffled in the very conservative royal establishment, but the Queen supported her husband. The television cameras were let into Westminster Abbey on that unseasonably cold, wet day in June 1953. Believe it or not, as well as the cameras, they crammed in more than 8,000 guests. There were 2,000 for the Queen's funeral in September, so I don't know how they did it. But nerves were running high. You can imagine the eyes of the world are on the Abbey. And as the Queen and her ladies were waiting to go in, one of those ladies became so nervous that she almost fainted. And somebody turned to the Queen herself and said, "You must be feeling nervous too, ma'am." And she replied, "Well, of course I am. But I really do think Oriel will win." And that was her horse who was racing in the coronation derby. Well, it wouldn't all be plain sailing for the Queen. And actually, the greatest crises of her reign tended to involve not she herself, but members of her family. First up, her sister Margaret, who, like her uncle Edward VIII, fell in love with someone she couldn't marry and stay part of the royal family. She was in love with Peter Townsend. He was a divorcee. And so ultimately she was forced to choose, as Edward had to choose between love and royal duty, but she chose royal duty. Again, though, it's not quite that romantic story that it's been portrayed as, particularly by The Crown, much as I love The Crown. They got it a little bit wrong here, because actually Margaret could have married Peter Townsend. Times had changed enough, and the Royal Marriages Act said that if she'd reached the age of 25, if she'd waited till then, she could have chosen anybody to marry within reason. And so the Queen advised her to wait, and she did. She waited till she was 25, by which time she'd gone off Peter Townsend. So she gave him up very nobly for her royal duties. An even more public scandal involved the marriage of the Queen's eldest son and heir, Prince Charles as he was then, to Lady Diana Spencer. It seemed like a fairy tale. When they married on that hot July day back in 1981, I remember it well, I know I'm aging myself here, but the eyes of the world again were trained on the royal family, and it soon proved to be anything but a fairy tale. The War of the Waleses, the press coined it. This was the heyday of the tabloid press. They watched the every move of Charles and Diana's turbulent relationship and the collapse of their marriage, which ended in the most tragic way possible when the princess was killed in a car crash in Paris. I struggle to believe it was 25 years ago this summer. And then in more recent times, the scandals kept coming. Of course, the Queen's younger grandson, Prince Harry, who married the American actress Meghan Markle, they suddenly announced their departure from their royal duties amidst allegations of bullying and racism. But there were happier times in the late Queen's reign. And I think the royal weddings are when we see the pomp and the pageantry writ large. And this is when a quote from the Victorian period really rings true for me. Somebody said then, the mass of people expect a king or queen to look and play the part. They want to see a crown and scepter and all that sort of thing. They want the gilding for their money. This is when everybody loves a royal event. Everybody, that is, except the bridesmaid, bottom left of that photograph, who has really had enough of those cheering crowds. Always changing, always the same. That was said to be what an ideal monarch should be. In other words, they should keep up with the times, but they should uphold tradition. Well, I think the late Queen did both of those things. She's not seen as a great innovator, but she streamlined the royal family's finances, reducing its burden on the public purse. I think her greatest innovation, though, and probably her greatest legacy, is that she finally introduced equality into the royal succession, so that a new act made law in 2013 stipulates that the firstborn child of the monarch will inherit, whether that child is male or female. It only took 1,000 years, but we got there in the end. She did, though, of course, uphold those traditions that are so important to the royal family. And the thread of continuity that she symbolised offered a much-needed sense of certainty in a rapidly changing, often frightening world, and therein, perhaps, lay her greatest lesson for her successor. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy. That was wonderful. We have got some time to open up the floor to some questions, and rather than myself or any of my colleagues from the Alumni Relations Office doing so, I would like to introduce a PhD student in history who is in a similar subject to Tracy to come and facilitate that for us. So, Emily Birch, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Well, to kick things off, I'm actually going to ask a question of my own. Which of Henry VIII's wives is your favourite and why?
Oh, great. I love this question. Anne of Cleves actually is my favourite because, well, a number of reasons, but she was the most sensible, didn't stand on principle, gave Henry his annulment, got 5 palaces, £20,000 a year, lived a happy life. And she was really the one who got away, and yet she's been dismissed as the ugly wife who Henry couldn't stand the sight of. Let's face it, he was no oil painting at the time that they were married. So Anne of Cleves, she's been overlooked. I absolutely love her.
And do we have any questions in the audience?
There is a roving mic, I believe. It's just heading your way.
Coming down for you.
Okay. I wondered how Henry VIII's love letters had got into the Vatican. Were they evidence in a divorce? That would seem very peculiar.
Can I just say how intimidating it is to be asked a question by my former professor, Barbara English? I was quaking in my shoes then as to what you were going to ask. So isn't it intriguing that they've ended up in the Vatican? The theory that convinces me the most is that we know they made their way there before Henry got his annulment. And the theory is that it was a supporter of Catherine of Aragon who stole those letters and made sure the Pope saw them, because they didn't put Henry in a very good light as a faithful husband. And so they were used actually in evidence to the Pope to convince him not to grant the annulment. It's only a theory, but we know that the letters were there, as I say, before the annulment was granted. So I think that's probably the one that holds the most water, but fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions at all?
Oh, got a question down here.
Which is your favourite room in Hampton Court Palace?
Oh, thank you for this question. It has to be, now it doesn't sound particularly glamorous, but it's apartment 33. So the reason we have apartment numbers is that it's from the days when Hampton Court was pretty largely grace and favour apartments. So former courtiers, people who worked for the royal family and the like, used to actually live in Hampton Court. Apartment 33, the reason I love it is because it's not open to the public. That's not why I love it, but because it's so much history happened there. It's where Jane Seymour gave birth to the future Edward VI, and also where she died 12 days later. Now it's changed so much. You would walk into it and think, why on earth have you chosen that as your favourite room? It looks like an office now. But when you think of what happened there, it still gives me shivers down the spine. And I'm on a campaign to open it up to the public, to restore it to something of its former glory. I will remain on that campaign. I see it as my retirement campaign, because I'm not leaving until I've done that. So thank you for that question. Thank you. Any others? Oh, there's a gentleman with his hand up.
Thanks very much. Great whiz through thousands of years in a very short time. It's almost like horrible histories, but really fantastically well compressed. Thank you. A question I had was, you mentioned obviously Queen Victoria coming out of mourning and then getting to that point where she becomes identified as that figure we know. And it struck me, you kind of mentioned it in passing, but I wondered if you could comment a bit more. One of the things that happens in the 1870s is that her favorite Prime Minister, Disraeli,
Yeah.
kind of manifests or creates this moment for her, becoming the Empress of India.
Yes.
And then moving her into the space where she becomes the emblem of Imperial Britain.
Yes.
To the point where statues are obviously throughout every single Commonwealth country placed in her honor. And I wonder if you could comment on that as part of that myth making. Is that
Yes.
that's something that signifies something, isn't it?
It's such an important moment, and thank you for highlighting it. Yeah, Disraeli, by far Victoria's favourite Prime Minister, he once said, when it comes to flattering the Queen, one should lay it on with a trowel. And I think that's why she loved him so much. But yes, he did help to create this myth, really, as the empress, the mother of her people. There were comparisons made to Gloriana, to the fairy queen she was known as, and I think actually, he was the ultimate image maker for Victoria. And I think, as I say, a lot of the reasons that we still look back on Victoria as one of our greatest monarchs is thanks to Disraeli. So thank you for making that point.
Have we got more questions, either on this side or got one down either?
You've mentioned the royal line following through. Would you like to comment on the legitimacy?
Ha! Not if I want any hope of an OBE in future, no. I joke. Yes, isn't that interesting? Because the current line really has taken a few side steps, hasn't it? If we even just look at the Tudors, they were descended from an illegitimate line, actually. They were descended from John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford at the time when they were not man and wife but lovers. So the Tudors were very aware of their fragility in that respect. And then, of course, it's taken a few side steps, and most notably, I think, and the time when the legitimacy really came to the fore was at the end of the Stuart period. So when Queen Anne died in 1714, there were others with a much stronger blood claim to the throne, but they were Catholic. And Parliament had decreed that the monarch had to be Protestant. So that's when they did a major tangent over to Germany and selected the electors of Hanover because they were Protestant. But their claim was weaker than the living sort of Stuart descendants. And that's why you get the rise of the so-called Jacobites, the supporters of the ousted King James II and his descendants. Because there was a real sense that actually this Hanoverian lot, they're just distant relatives, they shouldn't be on the throne. Interesting fact is that in terms of the modern day royals, actually the Boleyns still have a stake in the modern day royal family because Prince William is a direct descendant of Anne Boleyn's sister Mary. So that's an interesting, just little aside, interesting to me as a Tudor historian. But yes, perhaps when it comes to legitimacy, it doesn't do to be too focused on the detail, should we say. Any others?
Question down the front.
Hello, and thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Thank you. You mentioned, as you went through, that there were occasionally times where we missed out on a monarch, and that may have been a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah.
But are there any particular monarchs we've missed out of because maybe they've died too early? So I'm thinking of the Black Prince, for example.
Yes.
An example of where the monarchy jumped from father to grandchild rather
Yes.
than missing out the in-between.
Yes, absolutely. There are a number of occasions, and I love that it's so intriguing. In fact, there used to be a course here on the what-ifs of history, I remember, and I love that, the kind of imagining. Another example would be the eldest son of King James I, who was Prince Henry, and he was seen as a magnificent all-rounder. He was a great sportsman, he was a great intellectual, he was very popular with the people, until he contracted a fever and died suddenly. And then his brother became Charles I, and things went rather horribly wrong. I would say just another part of my answer would be, another intriguing thing would be to consider who we might have had as monarch if that act of succession had come through from 2013, come through earlier. So if firstborn child, not firstborn son, had been the rule. And then, Elizabeth of York, for example, she wouldn't have just been the wife of Henry VII, she'd been queen, arguably. And, there are many other examples. Victoria's eldest daughter, Victoria, again, arguably a sort of better candidate than her naughty younger brother, Bertie, Edward VII. So that's another intriguing one, I think. But yeah, it's another reason I keep coming back for more, really.
Have we got any further questions?
I should say as well that if anybody wants to come and ask me a question afterwards rather than in front of everybody, I'd be happy to do it, and this gives me a shameless way of saying I'll be signing books afterwards, you see. So you can come up and talk to me then. There is one. Great.
Jenny.
You mentioned The Crown, but which is your favourite film or TV portrayal of the royal family?
Oh, well, can I just say about The Crown? Because I've just written a review of season 5, which is out on the 9th of November for BBC History. So I got to see it early. I think it's the best season yet. It's amazing. The cast is amazing. My favourite, there are so many, because what I tend to do is look at dynasties. So rather, it's quite hard to look at something that covers obviously the whole history, because filmmakers don't tend to do that. I think my all-time favourite screen portrayal of a monarch has to be Miranda Richardson as Elizabeth I in Blackadder. I think she nailed it. I think she absolutely nailed it. So yeah, she'll never be bettered for me.
We got more questions in the audience?
Okay.
No?
And that feels a good time to wrap up. So thank you, Emily. Thank you again, Tracy. As Tracy mentioned, we are going to set up a table outside in the foyer. Tracy's brought some books with her. She is very kindly offered to chat with you and sign copies of the book. So if you would like to come and purchase a book, then please do. And thank you again for being here. And a final round of applause, please, for Tracy. Thank you.
Thank you.